Bom dia! Hello everyone. Welcome to this virtual way of talking to you. As you can see, I'm not in Portugal. I'd love to be there, but unfortunately, due to reasons we all know, I'm still here at home at my wonderful little place in Munich. And I'm here today to talk to you about the next level, what comes after open source. And it sounds like a whole mouthful, but when you think about it, it actually becomes quite simple. So let's go through this. First of all, who am I and why am I here? My name is Wildeboer. As you can obviously see, I work at Red Hat. My job title is Evangelist, which means that I spend a lot of time talking about things and thinking about things, which is, a wonderful thing to do in this world. I've joined Red Hat 15 years ago when open source was beginning to take hold in not only the developers space, but also in companies and in big organizations. And when you think about the journey that we went through over those 15 years from 2005 until now, you see how many things have changed and how many things open source has changed. And when I say open source, I mean it more or less in the same way as free software. There are some differences between open source and free software that some of you are well aware of. I will not dive into that because it's not the topic of today. But if you're interested into details, you will find a long history of discussions, agreements, disagreements, and open fights about what is the right way to do stuff. For me, open source has always been more than just code. I started with code a very long time ago, and I still code a little bit at home, setting up some of my home automation myself, and typically it fails because I'm not that good anymore. But that shouldn't stop me from trying, and it shouldn't stop you from trying and starting to do this. Open source is still the most accessible way to get into software development, into actually working with machines and doing stuff with them and finding out how they tick and what you can do with them, what they can learn from you, but also what you can teach them. However, does it stop with code? Well, for a lot of people it does. And that makes also a lot of sense when you think about what we are doing with it nowadays. Our modern life is filled with computers, with IT, with digital technology. And a really big part of that, a big chunk of that, is running on open source software. I would even go as far as saying our modern world that we live in without open source is next to impossible. And that's a damn good thing when you think about it. Just right now in this situation of a global pandemic where we have to wait for a vaccine to come and we have to work from home, just imagine how you would have done this, say, 20, 30 years ago, or maybe even 50 years ago. We are in a very special position nowadays with all these technology. And let me just focus on the part of that, the software part that is open source. I dare say the internet wouldn't work without open source. I even dare say a lot of the technologies you use in your everyday life are relying on open source. Cloud computing is the result of the open source movement, not the other way around. Many people think that, a lot of things happened first and then this and that, but I see the driving factor behind everything has always been openness and sharing. And I want to explain that a little bit more in depth to set the stage before we move to what I call the next level of open. When we look at modern technology, at the modern stacks that are being used everywhere, one of the things you will notice is that while we live in a very competitive market with companies fighting each other for market share and etc., a lot of the basic functionality is more or less the same. It doesn't really make a difference on the lower levels of the software stack, how you use them, because everybody needs the same stuff. You need transaction engines, you need databases. Nowadays you need containers and virtualization and all that kind of stuff. When you look at this from, a slightly more distant perspective, you start to notice a pattern. And this is across all verticals. And this is one of the things that we at Red Hat have been thinking about for quite some time now. If this is your complete stack that you use, then the first thing that is different to 20 years ago is that more or less everything is nowadays software defined. The time of specialized hardware, very expensive specialized hardware, is more or less gone. A lot of the things are now being done in software, pure software only. and it has become a lot cheaper and more standardized. And with all of that, when everything moves into the software plane, you start to notice these patterns that I talk about. And this pattern is here. This is your IT stack. And in that IT stack, you will find out that there's, maybe at the very top here, there's 20% of functionality that actually sets you apart, that makes you special in your market, that gives you value, creates margin. But the bottom part, that 80% down here, is more or less non-competitive functionality that everybody needs anyway. Now, this is where open source comes in. This is what we do. We focus on that 80% because we believe that 80% of all of this can be done the open source way. This has led to cloud computing. This has led to containers, to OpenStack, and all the other things you have been hearing. It's this drive for standardization on the lower level so that you can focus on the higher levels. And why reinvent the wheel for every vertical or every company even in this 80% if there is a far better way of working with this? And this far better way, obviously, is open source. So in that sense, Red Hat is the 80% company. We focus on all of these moving parts, and this is not just Linux. In the past it was. We became big as a Linux company. And nowadays we are more or less this 80% stack company. We do the containers, the virtualization, the storage solutions, and all of these stuff that are not necessarily competitive, but that everybody needs, and you want to get the most out of it. Now, working with open source on these parts allows a fantastic thing to happen, and that is communication. We can now openly talk about it because we're not giving away competitive advantage or corporate secrets. In that 80%, in an ideal world, that of course will never exist, but we're getting closer. In an ideal world, this would mean that all of this 80% is completely accessible to anyone. This allows the sharing of knowledge, the exchange of information, and also the education of people in an accessible way that simply hasn't existed before. You can look up the source code yourself. You can participate in open source communities. You can become part of this. You can even find a good job. By the way, Red Hat is hiring. And you can share this knowledge with your peers, with your colleagues, and other people around you in small ways or in big ways. You can work with Raspberry Pi at home. You can build your little home automation stuff. Or you can build giant space stations running on open source. Yes, there is actually a Red Hat Enterprise Linux server in the ISS above us as we speak. Now, what does this lead to? For us, it leads to focusing on these 80% and making sure it works in the best possible way for as many verticals and customers and private end users as possible. That's what you see in our technology stack and the way we interact with the upstream world. We openly invite you to participate in that, to become part of it, not necessarily by immediately working for Red Hat, but by collecting experiences and sharing knowledge in whatever way is fit for your life. All of this has become the new normal in software development. The open way of developing software is the default way of doing this. That discussion is effectively over. Which brings us to the next level, which brings us to the point that I announced in my title, which is, the next level. The next level is something that has been growing for a long time, but we see it very clearly now, especially now in these times. We at Red Hat think that one of our biggest advantages we have is this long experience in this field and the way that we work and define our work and the way we run our company is showing you more than just, a company building products. It's a whole culture behind it that is based on sharing. And we think it's about time that we start to not necessarily sell, but offer our culture as a service to everyone. We know that the way we work in open source delivers best results in the fastest possible way. And we want all of you to be able to do the same thing. And we don't just, see this as whatever kind of weird philosophical mission or whatever. We see it in a very practical way. We've published books about this, the Open Organization. We have created a concept called the Open Innovation Labs, where we bring developers and teams from our customers together with Red Hat developers to solve a specific project the open source way, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to make all the code open source. It's about how to do it. If it becomes open source, well, that's super duper. We like it that way. We want to have more open source out there, but we totally understand that that is not always the case. But working the open source way changes perspectives, allows you to look at things in a more cooperative, more open way. We think it's about time that it moves away from just software into a lot of other fields. We actively support initiatives for diversity and inclusivity, which for us is a natural thing. We have developers working on technology to make computers accessible for blind people, for example. Why not? Because they're good developers and we want them to work for us and with us. So, if they can make the tools that make work simpler for them and better for them, and they can make it open source, well, how cool is that? We take our technology and our experiences into schools in a program called Collab, where we actually, with children, work on open source technologies, explain to them how stuff works, create these local communities inside a school that then can expand across the world to include more. We think that open is so much more than just code, and we invite you to join us on this journey. And you can do this in several ways. Well, of course, from a corporate perspective, by using our products and buying subscriptions. Obviously, we want you to see how stuff works in real life. But we also invite you as a developer. We have developer subscription programs that are totally for free for everyone. You can just sign up online and download all of our stuff and start working with it. We also make our stuff available in the cloud. We think about the future of IT as being a mixture. We don't necessarily think that on-premise computing will completely go away, even though a lot of other companies will tell you that the future is the cloud and only the cloud. I'm not so sure about that, especially since we are here in Europe. We have, some stricter way of looking at privacy and data protection rules. So how do you build solutions that span all of these different deployment models in the perfect possible way? Again, with open source, we think we can deliver on that. So no matter if it's OpenShift in the cloud or OpenShift on-premise, the container solutions that we build and share there, that we make available via container stores, all of these things together show you the technology side of open source and the future of it. But behind that, and the next level, is how do we treat this from a communication perspective and from a human perspective? How do we make this technology accessible to as many people as possible in a way that they can not only use it in a positive way, but also contribute to it? And that contribution to software becomes a very natural thing, because that's the way we progress with open source into the future. So putting all of this together, a journey we started a long, long time ago is now in a very important phase where we more or less define the future of IT with open source technologies, where we openly invite all of you to become part of it, where we do not only fully share our knowledge, because in open source you don't need secrets anymore, but where we also invite you to think about the consequences of that. If you go to our website, there is a part on our website where we have a project that we call Open Source Stories, where we produce documentaries on how open source technologies are used all across the world. And I'm not talking about, customer success stories or whatever, not at all. What we do in Open Source Stories is we show how it is used for prosthetics for children, for example, with 3D printers and people coming together to work on this. Open source, open hardware-based trackers for sheep in the mountains to make sure you don't lose your stock. Open source has been doing so many things in the past 20, 30 years. And in my opinion, the journey has just begun. So when you think about Red Hat, don't only think about, the Red Hat. Don't only think about the products that we sell, the subscriptions that we sell. Also look at the bigger picture we see behind all of this. Join us on our journey, become part of this, and we will see even more things happening. look at the current crisis we're in, a pandemic, a virus that was more or less unknown before. And within months, we managed to decode it using a lot of technology, make these decoded genetic structure available to researchers all across the planet in a very open source way. We made communication happen between all of these teams all across the planet in a unified way to fight this virus and make sure that we can stop this pandemic before it becomes really bad. We are in a delicate phase right now to get all of this sorted, but with open access to data, to technology, and with all of the things we can do nowadays, we have come to the point where vaccines are now in phase 3 clinical trials. Something so fast has never happened before. I'm not saying that's because of open source or even that's because of Red Hat. That would be totally wrong. But I do say that the open source movement and all the open source and free software developers out there have been part of making this possible, of having the world unite in this way to fight something that is a threat to us. Let's continue this road. I think it's a good way to work together and to do stuff. And if you have any questions after that, I'll be available in the chat and we can discuss for more things after this. And with that, I say again, thanks for the invitation. Think about what you can do for the world in open source, how open source can help you in your day-to-day life and maybe beyond of that. And let's work on building a better future the open way. Thank you for listening.